Hello, everyone. This is the third lecture entitled The Reappearing Pheasant, leading to a gathering of Italian and American poets that will take place at the Casa Italiana Zerilli Marimò in the spring of 2022. The first lecture was devoted to a description of the essential features of a modern poem. The second lecture provided some of the historical circumstances under which modern Italian poetry was written. Poetry and politics, art and politics. We spoke of the so-called crisis of the mid-70s, the legacy of experimentalism, the demise of the neo avant-garde, the permanence of its motivations, etc. All these items can be retrieved from the lectures. And now we are about to embark upon a third lecture, which is basically a survey of the poetry written in the last decades of the 20th century and some tentative steps towards a mapping. The material brought forth has been selected basically from the second volume of an anthology called Those Who From Afar Look Like Flies, which we will refer to as The Flies from this moment on, and which will be published in 2022 by the University of Toronto Press. Like all anthologies, these flies are necessarily ground in arrogance. Works that do not fit the editor's agenda are excluded, and features that ought to be merely indicative of a given moment in the development of a tradition are assumed as embodiment of absolute aesthetic values, the included authors being treated as models worthy of imitation. As a result, the impulse to renovate is stifled, and Ezra Pound's imperative, make it new, is thwarted. In reality, on the day an anthology hits the shelves, it begins to obsolesce. An even more absurd situation occurs when the anthology is based on the all too often unexplained predilections of the anthologists. Nothing is more futile than collections that are lacking a critical approach. Whimsical selections are not illegal, of course. However, they should be regarded as original works, not as paradigmatic landscapes. Private affairs and anthologies do not mix. No effort to pass apodictic truths as logical procedures will ever obtain except when and where a form of cultural fascism is implemented. To avoid the two extremes of the merely idiosyncratic on the one hand and the absurdity of an all-encompassing bird's-eye view on the other, The Flies reflects the category of the typical, as defined by Lukács, a character, in our case a poet, is simultaneously a type and a particular individual. He is the member of a society of writers investigating the potential and the relevance of language employed at its poetic level, as well as an individual with a distinct, impressive, and expressive voice. The principal bone of contention is whether or not the poetic work of the neo-avant-garde, of which we spoke in lecture 2, and broadly speaking of what we have termed research poetry, again documented in the first volume of The Flies, published in 2017, constitutes a viable legacy for poets who began to write in the 70s, giving their voices a ring of necessariness and relevance that is sorely lacking in poets who have chosen to disregard it. Flies, too, assumes that this is indeed the case, in opposition to other gatherings of poets that inscribe any and all language-first poetry in the rubric of incomprehensible aberrations, a mere parenthesis in the natural flow of poetic evolution. Flies too, in other words, remains faithful to the principle established by Giuliani, I mean Alfredo Giuliani, not Rudolph Giuliani, in the initial paragraph of his 1961 introduction to the Novissimi. Undoubtedly, in every age, poetry cannot be true unless it is contemporary. To the question then of what it means to be contemporary, there can only be one answer. Poetry is to be contemporary with our own perception of reality, or rather, with the language that reality speaks within us through its irreconcilable signs. Time's jury has not come in yet with a verdict. While we patiently wait, let us begin by observing how the poetry of authors operating under the realistic aegis of the neo-experimentalism advocated by Pasolini did undergo in the subsequent decades a major stylistic and language-driven swerve, one that, if not fully harmonious with the neo-avant-garde concerns, would be hard to account for except by acknowledging the agency of some of the innovational devils that fostered its fertile restlessness. For as long as it lasted, in other words, by the late 60s, early 70s, neo-avant-garde may have run its course, not its raison d'etre, however, nor the impetus that launched it, and which Ezra Pound has epitomized in one of his own categoric imperatives, make it new. Here's a sample of Roberto Roversi poetry written in the wake of his Officina experience. The poem is entitled The German Emperor. When I came to Lombardy, I was young then, through roads gnawed by whistling locomotives, a boy's weeping migrated to the border. The shadow of mountain dwellers rose towards the sky, and waiters in warm bistros took the lid off delicate soup tureens for offices distracted by an adolescent eye. In the station's bomb shelter, while trains were burning, I remember, white against black glass, the woman sweetly rested her light hair on my knapsack. Soil for routed armies, fleeing to the mountains. Young leaves tremble in the moonlight, Austria, Switzerland, France, and the border. And here's a sample of poetry by the same poet published in 2001 from a collection called The Soccer Game. This is the same Roberto Roversi, and in a fashion, in a style that would be hardly recognizable if his name were not there. Why are you falling, summer wind? Sun wind? Summer wind. The soccer player says, some carry their destiny in their name. Before the world leaves us or abandons us, I will be able to gather a few fragments of words to understand the objections of my friends. The noise of years, these last adventures. At the beginning of 99, I reached the cave of my thoughts. At first, it was tears, then long sighs. We will lose the virtue of love if the game does not end with a precise shot at the moment of waiting. The stands empty, the people scattered, only the next match will fill its homeland with flags, voices. The voices cover the water with a lot of gaiety. They are distant voices. The soccer player thinks about the friend who is not there. He can count on his fingers the days of life, and around the lion circus, the voices are lost It's the moment of awaiting. No swallow signals hope. The shadows lead to a hasty retreat. The watchful enemy follows the tracks of flight. The soccer player says, the ball does not end up in the sea. It hides along the clouds, etc., etc. Pasolini himself, the main voice of the Officina group, proved to be susceptible to the coaxing of renewal and switched from the discursive tone of his 1957 and much heralded Gramsci's Ashes, perfectly cadenced and woven with rhymes and assonances, to the convulsive and hurried fragmentations of Transhumanize and Organize, published in 1971. Let me read a sample from Gramsci's Ashes, and then, of course, I'll read one from Transhumanize. A red cloth like those of the partisans once wore around their necks, beside the urn on softened ground, two geraniums, a rather different shade of red, and you, here banished with your hard, uncatholic grace, registered among the dead foreigners, Gramsci's Ashes, torn between hope and disillusion. I draw near, having chanced into this spare green corner before your grave, your spirit here at rest among these trees. Or perhaps it's something else, more ecstatic, but more modest too, some drunken adolescent, symbiosis between sex and death. And in this country where you ferment, knew no rest, I sense how wrong you were here in the quiet of the tombs, and yet how right as well about or unsure lot when writing those last splendid pages during the days of your murder. And now this is from Transhumanize and Organize, as I said, published in 1971, in the decade that we are, at the beginning of that decade that we are trying to assess and see whether or not the legacy of the experimental line of poetry is active. The poem is entitled Materials for the Introduction. With the fall of the father and mother, no longer parents, all other principles shall fall. Since, moreover, the other side of believing is making, he who does not believe does not make. And he who makes believes, but things will change. There shall be only the making, and change shall have no other meaning than change. In the place where Venice once stood, let us resume the discussion of the sun. The sun beat down on tilled fields. I don't know whether it was Caesarea, Cerveteri, or Certa. The sun beat down on Spello. A youth obedient to the religion of the fathers, I follow the sun into realm of the dead. Journey to the necropolis, ethnological syncretism, juxtaposition of tomb styles. But let it not be said that this is only about funerary constructions. All the hierarchies of the Talensi ancestors, for example, civilization heaped upon civilization, no perspective, all frontal. The perspective are inner, poetic surfaces, the chaos of the entire world of the dead. It can have various chapters, either the general histories of peoples or the specific, or to put it better, the monographic. While stylistic, compositional, and even logical freedom was gaining traction in the enemy territory, in the fields of poetry that opposed the workings of the neo avant-garde, signs of unrest and renewal were occurring in the field of the novissimi as well. So the 70s are really an ebullient decade, as we mentioned last time. And this is not only true of poetry, but of social life in general. Let me just remind you that we think of the 70s as the so called years of lead. But during that decade, when many, many horrible things happened to the nation and to the people in Italy, many very social moments of progress were also recorded. And so the 70s are probably going to go down in history as a most important decade in the history of Italian life. So, as I said, the poets of Officina and their followers felt the impression of this linguistic turmoil created by the poets of the New Avant-Garde, the Novissimi, the Group 63. But the Novissimi themselves, after the 60s, in the 70s, felt that a new phase was at hand. And here is a sample of the incessant stylistic evolution borne out by the poetry of Elio Pagliarani, a 1960 trailblazer in the field of neo-epic poetry, who in later decades resorted to expressions of minimalist and estranged logic. Now, I want you to look at this page. This is the cover page of Elio Pagliarani's book called Lezione di Fisica, Physics Lesson, and you can see how elongated this the physical book is, because the lines were so long that the printer was necessitated to print them horizontally. I'm going to read a passage from it, which is also very funny. Pagliarani included in his epic poem text from different sources, and this is from a book called Green Humor. It is the description of how a school child resolved a problem given to him by his school teacher. A kid sees rabbits and chickens in a barnyard. He counts 18 heads and 56 paws. How many chickens and rabbits are there in the barnyard? You might consider an animal species with 6 paws and 2 heads, the chicken rabbits. In the barnyard, there are 56 paws. 6 paws equal 9 chicken rabbits. 9 chicken rabbits then necessitate 9 by 2, 18 heads. Thus, the remainder is 18 minus 18, 0 heads in the barnyards. Degree in philosophy, then they kicked him out, etc., etc. There is a digression here. Then we go back to the issue. But these animals have 9 by 6, 54 paws, so then 56 minus 54 equal 2. There remain 2 paws in the barnyard. You might consider another animal species that could be de-chickened rabbit. You subtract 1 chicken from 1 rabbit, the resulting animal is a de-chickened rabbit having 1 head minus 1 head equals 0 heads, 4 paws minus 2 paws equal 2 paws. These 2 paws in the barnyard, again, a digression, the regressive human label linguistic generic average, and then back to the issue. There's in the barnyard 9 chicken rabbits minus 1 de-chicken rabbit. In other words, 9 rabbits plus 9 chickens plus 1 rabbit minus 1 chicken. And now rabbits and chickens will have 9 plus 1 equal 10 rabbits, 9 minus 1, 8 chickens. The result is 8 chickens and 10 rabbits in the barnyard, and it can be placed into linguistic circulation. Strikingly enough, in 1985, Elio Pagliarani shrank his poetry and issued a number of very brief compositions under the title of Platonic Exercises, word sequences pulled and rearranged from actual Platonic dialogues, Plato's dialogues. I do not mean by beauty of figures such beauty as that of living beings, for example, or painted images, but says the argument, understand me to mean particular lines, straight, curved, and the surfaces or solid which are formed out of them by turning lathes and rulers and measures of angles. I mean to say that if arithmetic measuration and weighing be taken away from any art, that which remains will not be much. The rest will be only conjecture and the better use of the senses which is given by experience and practice, in addition to a certain power of guessing, which is commonly called art. I assume the differences are quite striking, and it really testified to what Alfredo Giuliani had addressed more than once about the evolution of the group 63, the Novissimi, the neo-experimental writer, and they're going beyond the platform with which they had started their literary itinerary. A particularly intriguing instance of this is to be found in a 1977 essay entitled La neo-avanguardia s'è buttata via perché non avrebbe dovuto. The neo-avant-garde let itself go. Why not? Which was recently reissued in Il Verdi in a comprehensive analysis that encompasses not only the Novissimi, but the entire Gruppo 63. Giuliani reminded Philippe Soler, who had posed the question, what happened with Gruppo 63, a question that Giuliani considered thoroughly off-key and anachronistic, that everyone agreed to place the group in the area of modern art among recent antiquities. Therefore, no time for nostalgia, and even less so for an answer ex officio. Alberto Arbasino, in his brilliantly annoyed answers to Soler, also reminded our local shitheads that some facts remain even after the end of the group itself. Not only are there several works in existence, as Arbasino said, but also some undeniable influxes and some doubts as to hows and whys of literature, doubts that before Group 63, no one in the fine old times of neorealism and Strega Prize kitsch had ever dreamed to pose. Whether or not the impetus that shook Italian poetry in the second half of the Novecento can be said to have originated with the Novissimi and other unlabeled research poets, as fully documented in Flies 1, to draw a map of the poetry written in Italy and in the remaining decades of the second millennium and the early years of the third is a formidable task. The anthology of Flies 2 feel like those cartographers called to draw maps of a world that had been tentatively explored and, in fact, not yet fully explored. Many vectors can be safely identified. More will come to light when, during the seminar and in the spring gathering of Italian and American poets at the Casa Italiana Zerilli Marimò, the picture will be drawn extensively. Here we shall limit this initial survey to a couple of directions, which we'll call neo-epic poetry, in which social and historical events are reported in a language whose lexical, syntactical, rhetorical, and rhythmical implications are carefully deployed in search of a truth other than the apparent truth that inheres in simple and language description. And neologic, that's the second type of investigation, which does not posit poetry as the expression of irrational emotions, but reveals the absolute presence in it of a rationality of its own, tested, in fact, since the time of the surrealists, and capable of producing a truth that, while it may not be demonstrable, it is at the same time undeniable. I'm reading now a somewhat longish excerpt from a poem by Vincenzo Frungillo called Every Five Strokes, a five-canto poem published in 2009. Five strokes refer to the fact that swimmers, professional swimmers, athletes, lift their heads above the water, from the water, every five strokes. And the poem is dedicated to those women swimmers of the East Germany that had been trained and hormonized to a point of disfiguring their body. Young women who had their life destroyed so that the nation could win a few gold medals at the Olympic Games. This is sequence one of Canto 1, dedicated to Ute, one of the swimmers. The time of memory drips from the foot in regular circles of water and chlorine. Ute reopens the space of history. Tired, at the edge of the pool, she recalls those who showed her the way. The escape route from poverty, yelling all together in a burst of joy. Pushing with our arms, you will tear down this titanic cage. They shouted loudly, and the red spray of the primordial bricks of the highest wall. She is still a child, burdened herself with that yell, and chose to take on the hardest task. I'll save these voices from the stench of piss. I can. I'll take them with me to a place that is free and safe. I'll make their body out of my own. I'll make their flight out of my gestures. Free from this bias of those who are in the wrong, she now swims in the blue water of the pool, transparent to herself in her sharp-edged strokes on the surface that shines like hoarfrost. She listens to the splashes of the water. She cuts and measures the rhythm of life on her temple. No defeat now, no victory. Her life story, she decides, will be measured in hundredths of a second. Ute knows she is the best and keeps training without pause. 3 hours in the morning and 3 at night. Her body grows, adapting to the strain, and each day the shape that was slightly and bony under the pale blonde of sorrow changes. What doesn't disappear from under her eyes is the look of a girl who burns slowly when alone and watches others who chat and do not train. Ute is strict with those who stay on dry land and don't understand the need for a flipper hand, of those who seize the water's resistance beneath their chests. She is strict with herself, and thus she strives against the unmoving randomness of her land. She feels alien, but decisive against the masses who threaten her. Ute is the blue proof of a pledge, the liquid crystal body of a champion. This will have to suffice as an example of the neo-epic poetic writing going on during and after the 70s. And now I'd like to introduce to you a prose poem by Lucio Saffaro, who would have to be considered a champion of what we have been calling neologic. It has a rather complicated title called Abstract Perfumes of Landscape and a Fake Song from the Empyrean. It's a poem that has not been published yet and will be featured for the first time in the anthology that I've been referring to several times during the course of this speech. Memory was surpassed at more than one point. Thus began the first weight. Like a sail billowing with future tilting to the side in its rush towards nothingness. The number drawn was new, almost an element of separation between contiguous but profoundly diverse categories. My companion was still astonished by its apparition when I was already distancing myself from the game, intent on rebuilding the infinite. They asked me the reason for this, which to them seemed to be a sort of flight. But I was already going beyond the boundary of chance, and I could not explain the magnitude of my attempt, nor the temporal reduction that was the basis of its definition. From that time on, I never saw them again. Shortly after, the number changed, and with it, the meaning of the initial action was altered. The care and the very cipher of the secret names of the patron of memories. Poetry is dangerous. Adriano Spatola used to say, another poet who continued working in the 70s and 80s when he met a very premature death. He continued to work in the wake of the legacy of the neo-avant-garde. Adriano used to say that poetry is intimidating, like the sound of a tom-tom in the jungle. I think we should keep it that way. It's the only discourse the logic of destruction has been unable to gobble up. You're all invited to the Reappearing Pheasant. We now have precise dates. It's going to take place at the Casa Italiana Zerilli Marimo of New York University on April 7, 8, and 9, 2022. During the fall, we'll send you some reminders. In the meantime, I ask you kindly to meditate on some of the examples you have heard today and in the previous lectures, and hope that you will be curious enough to attend some of the sessions, if not all of them. Thank you very much.